So in the last video, we formatted dates using the internationalization API. So now let's actually format regular numbers. And let's start by doing some experiments in the console first before we move on to our application. So I'm just defining some number here. It doesn't really matter which one, just so we can experiment with it a little bit. Okay, so let's do the most basic formatting now, simply doing new, and then again, this Intl namespace. And now this time we use number format. And so this, again, takes in a local string. And so let's experiment with the US. Okay. And so all of this here creates a formatter. And then one more time on that, we can call the format method, where we then pass in what we actually want to format. And so that is this number. Let's just also log here to the console that this is about the US, so that we can then have some other locales as well. Okay, so you see that the number is now formatted using these dividers here. So these commas here as separators, so that it's easier to read 3,884,000 and so on. But let's see how it works in other countries. So in Germany, for example, it is different. Let's add some spaces here. Okay. And so here we want like this. And since we're doing this, let's try some other countries here as well. Let's just say Syria. Why not? So the one that I used earlier as well. So that is Arabic, and then the country is SY. And you see that in Germany, as in general in Europe, the separator is the dot, and then a comma for the decimal part. So basically just the opposite as it is in the US, as you see here. And then for Syria, well, it's even more different. I cannot even read this, of course. And of course, we can also just use the locale from the browser. So that would be navigator.language. And actually, let's log that here. And so, yeah, in the UK, it's basically the same as in the US. So again, this is just the most basic formatting, but let's now define an object here. So again, options for this formatting. But of course, now we have other properties in this object. It's no longer day or month or something like this, but instead we can specify the style, for example. And here we can say that this is a unit, and then we can set the unit property to something. And let's say mile per hour. And there are tons of units like this. And so as always, you can read more about the units that are available in the documentation. But let's see what happens now. No, but apparently nothing happens. Now we just need to pass in this options here, of course, into the number format function. So again, as a second argument, and let's do that here in all of the 4 at the same time, using these multiple cursors. And let's give it a save. And indeed, now we get this unit here. And one more time, you see that it's written differently in the US or in Germany, for example, or in Europe in general. And you see in Syria or in Arabic, apparently this is how you write miles per hour. Okay. But of course we can try others. For example, for temperatures, there is Celsius. And so indeed, we get degrees Celsius. So that is for units, but we can also say percent, and then the unit is completely ignored. So we get the percentage sign, and again it is different in different countries. So here we have this space. And then there's also currency. So these are the three different options for the style. So that's unit, percent, or currency. And again, if we have a currency, then the unit is just completely ignored. But we do have to then define the currency. So let's say euro, and for that it is like this. So EUR. And so if we give it a save, then we get indeed the euro sign. And so here in Europe it comes after the number, and in the US it comes before the number. And it's important to understand that we do indeed have to set this currency here, because the currency is not determined by the locale. Okay, so it's not defined by the country here, because it's of course possible to show, for example, euros in the US. All right, and so of course we have to define the currency here manually. So it's not going to be implied from the locale string. Okay. Finally, we can also turn off or on the grouping. So let's use grouping and let's experiment with false. And then you see that the number is just printed as it is without the separators, so the grouping. But let's get rid of this one here. And again, if you're interested in even more properties that you can set here in the options, then just check out the documentation here on MDN. Okay, but now what we're going to do is to actually use this knowledge and implement currencies here in our application. So let's move up here, and I'm going to start here in the movements. So where is that function? Now you see we have a lot of code here already, and in the real world we then split up all this code into different files. Okay, because as it is right now, it is indeed a little bit messy, but for now it is just okay as we have it. Now anyway, right now we are displaying the currency here in these movements right here. So we convert everything to 2 decimal places, and then we display the euro sign here ourselves. But now we want the internationalization API to take care of all of this. So let's create a variable out here so that we don't have to do all that formatting here in the template literal. So we do it outside here. So let's call it formatted movement. And then again, we use new, and then number format. And now you already know that we have the locale right in the account object. And so that's again ACC, right? So just as we did here for formatting the date, we use ACC.locale. And then we also need an options object. And this time, let's actually write that object right here. So we need to set the style to currency. And then we need to define the currency property. So just as we did earlier in this video. And let's just experiment a little bit here. Let's say that we want US dollars instead of euros. Okay. And so now here we can get rid of all of this, including the euro sign, and now simply use this value. So formatted movement. Okay, give it a save. And now we need to, of course, log in here. But before doing that, I see already that we have some problem here with is this object. And the problem is that we here didn't even call the format method. So all we did was to define this variable here as number format. And so that's then this formatter, remember. But on that, we then need to actually call the format method. And so this is where we pass in the value that should be formatted. And that is simply the current movement. So this mov value here. So if I save it now, then that should be fixed. And indeed, you already see US dollars right here. But anyway, let's log in as Jonas now. And yeah, everything is US dollars. However, the number itself here is of course still formatted in the Portuguese way. So that's the current locale of the current user. Remember? So that's Jonas, and the locale is PT. Remember? And so therefore, the number is still formatted in that way and not in an American way. That's only for the currency. Okay? So that's USD, but the rest is still according to the user's locale. So that's what I said earlier, that the currency is completely independent from the locale itself. So in this case, we have a European country with an American currency. All right. Now, indeed, we also have the currency in the accounts object. So we have the locale and also the currency. And so let's now get that currency also from the account itself. So that's right here. And so here we actually want account dot currency. So if I load it now, then indeed we get euros. All right. And if I log in as Jessica Davis, which has USD as the currency, then we get the dollars, and we get it also formatted in the American way. Because for Jessica Davis, the locale is also it is English in the US. And so this is what it looks like here, formatted for the US with US dollars. Of course, we could change this to euros, and then, of course, now we would have the euro sign. All right. So one more time, you can see how powerful this is and how easy it makes formatting for us developers. Okay. Now, anyway, that is the movements, but now we also have the currency in a lot of other places. For example, here in the balance, and then also down here in these statistics. So let's start to also implement the same formatting here in the balance. And so that is, that's right here. Okay, so here we also have this old way, basically, of formatting, but we know that we can do better. So we can now go ahead and grab all of this like this and paste it here and then use this. Okay. However, as you can guess, that is not a good practice because we are repeating the don't repeat yourself principle. Right? So let's get rid of this. And as you can guess, we will create a new function here, which will take care of formatting the currencies. So let's call it format cur, which stands for currency. So a new function. And let's create a very reusable function here. So instead of passing a whole account object into this function, which is very specific, of course, to this exact application, let's do a function that you could use in any other application. So basically a function that is less dependent on the underlying application data. Okay, and so instead, what we will do is to simply pass in all the data that this function needs to work with. So that's the value, the locale, and the currency. Okay, so again, we could pass the entire account object here instead of these two, but here we just want to do a reusable function. And so this is a lot better for that. All right. So this is the code that we had written earlier. And here we don't even need to create a new variable. All we will do is to return the result of this number format function. Now we just need to adapt this a little bit. So here it's just the locale that we get in here as an argument. And then here the same for the currency. And what we want to format is the value that we get in. All right. So again, a nice and simple reusable function that can take any value, any locale, and any currency, and will then return this value here nicely formatted for that locale and currency. So let's use that here. So of course, instead of what we had before, formatted mov will now become format the currency, and then the value is mov, the locale, which I think is the second one. Yeah, it is. So it's very handy, again, here in VS Code to just hover over the function name. So the locale is at account.locale and the currency at account.currency. And so we can get rid of this. Now I will just copy this part here. And so now what we want to format is account.balance. Okay. And we actually don't even have to store it into a separate variable first. We can just take this result directly and then display it as a text content here in our application. So if I log in now as Jonas, then this should already be nicely formatted, and indeed it is. So we see we have this nice separator here, which makes our number easier to read. And now as Jessica Davis, it should be the American separator, so with the comma here. Okay, so that's great. All that's left now is these three values down here. All right, but that should be easy enough with the function that we already created. So let's just copy it here. And then we simply basically need to paste it here to these three places. So here it is the incomes that we want to format, right? So incomes. Then here it is this part here. So the absolute value of the out. And then finally down here, it is the interest. Now I copied that code from earlier. So again, it is this interest that we want to format now. So interest. And indeed, you can already see, even without logging in, that it worked down here. So we have this nice separator here indeed. And so if we log in again with Jessica Davis to see it as US dollars, then we get this nice result here as well. Beautiful. And actually, that's it for the internationalization API. That's all I had to show you. But as I told you right in the beginning, there is a lot more potential in this API. To finish this section, let's quickly talk about timers in JavaScript. And we have two kinds of timers. First, the setTimeout timer runs just once after a defined time, while the setInterval timer keeps running basically forever until we stop it. So basically, we can use setTimeout to execute some code at some point in the future. So let's use this to simulate ordering a pizza. So when we order a pizza, it doesn't arrive right away, right? So instead, it's going to take some time, and we can simulate that. So let's write setTimeout, and then this function receives a callback function. So just like some array methods or DOM event handlers. right? And we already talked a lot about this. And I think we even used the setTimeout function here as an example of callback functions a bit earlier, right? So let's use an arrow function this time, actually. Because why not? And so here, let's just say, here is your pizza. And then just some pizza emoji here, maybe. All right. So this callback function here is the first argument of the setTimeout function. And so again, we do not call this function ourselves. We simply pass in this function as an argument to setTimeout. And it is this function who will then call our callback function in the future. And when does that future arrive? Well, that's what we specify here in the second argument. So here we pass in the amount of milliseconds that will pass until this function is called. So let's say we want to call this function after 3 seconds, and so we need to pass 3000. So 1 second is 1000 milliseconds, and so this is basically 3 times 1000. Okay, so let's give it a save, and you see the page reloaded. And now, after 3 seconds have passed, we get this log to the console. Okay, and so with this, we really delayed calling this function here, right, by exactly 3 seconds. And we can also say that we schedule this function call for 3 seconds later. All right. Now, what's really important to realize here is that the code execution does not stop here at this point. All right. So when the execution of our code reaches this point, it will simply call the setTimeout function. It will then essentially register this callback function here to be called later, and then the code execution simply continues. And we can prove that by doing something after the setTimeout. So let's say waiting. And if we now save this, then immediately we will see this waiting in the console. So let's check that. And indeed, we get waiting. And then after the 3 seconds, then this log here appeared. All right. So this is really important to understand. So again, as soon as JavaScript hits this line of code here, it will simply basically keep counting the time in the background and register this callback function to be called after that time has elapsed. And then immediately JavaScript will move on to the next line, which is this one. All right. And this mechanism is called asynchronous JavaScript. And we will talk about how exactly all of this works behind the scenes in a special section just about asynchronous JavaScript. Okay, but anyway, what if we now needed to pass some arguments into this function here? It's not that simple, right? Because we are not calling this function ourselves. So we are not using the parentheses like this, and so therefore we cannot pass in any arguments into the function. Right? Now, however, the setTimeout function here actually has a solution for that. And it works like this. So basically all the arguments here that we pass after the delay will be arguments to the function. So let me demonstrate that to you. So let's say here olives, and then another argument, spinach. And so here I can now specify the ingredients. So olives and spinach will be ingredients in our pizza. So let's say ingredient 1 and ingredient 2. And here we can then use them somehow. Let's make this a template literal. Let's give it a save here. And so the waiting once again appeared immediately. And then after 3 seconds, our string appeared logged to the console. And indeed, this third argument that we passed in did now become the first argument or the first parameter of our function here. And then the fourth argument became this second one. And if we passed in even more, we could then get access to them here in this callback function. All right, and that is essentially how the setTimeout function here works. There's just one more detail that I want to show you, which is the fact that we can actually cancel the timer at least until the delay has actually passed. So before these 3 seconds here have passed, we can cancel the timeout. And so let me show you how. Now to build this example, I first want to change something here. So I want to put the ingredients into an array. So let's say, again, olives and spinach. And so how would we then pass in these ingredients here? We're not going to do ingredients 0 and ingredients 1 like this, right? No, instead we will spread the array here using the spread operator. And so this will then take the elements out of the array and put them here basically comma separated. And so this now works exactly the same. But now what I want to do here is to say that if the ingredients include spinach, because that's something that many people don't like, so if the ingredients include spinach, then clear timeout. And so now here we need to pass in the name of the timer. And so we can basically assign this timer to a variable. So let's say simply, let's say pizza timer. And so here we can then use that variable, so that timer, to clear it. All right. So again, here we basically stored the result of the setTimeout function, which is essentially the timer. And then we can use that variable to clear the timeout. And then we can use that variable to basically delete the timer. And for that, we use clear timeout. And so now, since this array contains this spinach here, now you will not see the pizza string here printed to the console. All right. But if it did not include spinach, then of course, it would still work after 3 seconds. All right. So this is how the setTimeout function works. And that's actually it. That's all you need to know about the setTimeout function. It's pretty straightforward, right? So let's now actually go back to our application and implement a timer to simulate the approval of our loan. Okay. So when we click this button here to request a loan, then we get the value immediately right now. But typically a bank takes some time, like some days or some weeks, to approve that loan. And so let's simulate that here by taking like 2 or 3 seconds. So what happens when we successfully request a loan is essentially this code here, right? And so let's simply wrap all this code into a function. So curly braces, then function just like this, and then put all of this into a setTimeout. And then down here, give it a save, and then it should be nicely formatted. Okay, and now let's say, well, after 2.5 seconds. Okay, and so let's just see what it looks like in practice. So requesting a loan of 1,000. And so now it's going to take 2.5 seconds. And indeed, the bank just approved my loan here. So that was 10,000. Let's do something else. So count the seconds here. And now my loan was approved. And so then it appeared here in the movements, and it also appeared here in the balance. You saw that? So that makes our application a little bit more realistic. But let's go back now, because we also need to talk about setInterval. So we learned that setTimeout here simply schedules a function to run after a certain amount of time, but the callback function is only executed once. Now, what if we wanted to run a function over and over again, like every 5 seconds or every 10 minutes? Well, for that, we have the setTimeout function. So this one is going to be setTimeout. So let's use the setTimeout function to basically create a clock that will display in our console. So setTimeout, and then a function. And of course, I could have used an arrow function, but it doesn't really matter here. So our callback function, and let's create a new date here. So let's say now, and then new date. Okay, so this is nothing new at this point. And then let's just log that date, so that current date, to the console. And we want to execute this every 1 second. And so here we say 1 second. So let's see what happens. And indeed, once every second now, this should be executed. But it doesn't. And that's because I made the mistake of calling setTimeout again. But of course, as I was saying all the time, this one is actually called setInterval. So maybe you were already spotting this mistake, but now let's see what happens. So now, after each second here, we get the current time displayed to the console. So what's happening here is that this callback function is now executing every second. Okay? So every second a new date is created here and is then logged to the console. And of course, we could also say every 3 seconds. And then we would get the current time on the console every 3 seconds. You see? So it's adding 3 seconds each time now. But 1 second here makes a little bit more sense. Now, of course, you could print a real clock using this function now. Like you could get the current hour, minutes, and seconds from this now date. And so I would challenge you to do that actually, to take a minute or two in order to build like a real clock that is only logging the hours, minutes, and seconds here to the console. Now, I'm not going to do that here, but I think this would be a nice challenge to train a little bit the stuff that we've been using previously in the section. But for now, this is actually enough for this video. So take this challenge that I just mentioned, and then I'll see you soon in the next video. Welcome back. And this is going to be the last part of this project. So we're almost done here. Now, for security reasons, real bank applications will log out users after some inactive time. For example, after 5 minutes without doing anything. And that's what we will implement in this video using the setInterval timer. And let's start with one final look at our flowchart. So the timer appears in multiple places here, and the first one is right here. So whenever the user logs in, the logout timer will start or restart. All right. And then as soon as the logout timer expires, which will be after like 5 or 10 minutes, then we want to log the user out. All right. So basically that's what we will do with the timer, but let's start very simple. So the place where we want the timer is here in this function about the login. Okay, so this here is the handler function that handles the login. And so our timer will start here. Now we already have plenty of code here, as you see, right? And therefore, let's actually create a separate function which will start this logout timer. All right. So let's say start logout timer. And this function doesn't need any arguments. All it does is to basically export some functionality into an external function. So let's write some pseudocode here basically by writing some comments to say what exactly we are going to do here. So we will start by setting the time to, let's say, 5 minutes. Okay. Then we want to call the timer every second. Then in each call, so in each callback call, print the remaining time to the user interface. And then when the time is at 0, so after the timer basically expired, so when we reach 0 seconds, stop timer and log out user. Okay, and to make this a bit easier to visualize, let's go again here to our demo application. And so the timer that I mean is this one here, which actually starts at 10 minutes. And you see that after each second, a new time is basically printed here. All right, and I'm not going to wait for 10 minutes now, but when this reaches 0, then the user will, of course, be logged out. Okay. So let's basically do everything that we described here. So I'm setting the time for now just to 10 seconds. Okay, just so we see what's going on. Or actually, let's say 100 seconds, so that we have actually more than 1 minute. Then we want to call the timer every second. So basically what this means is to use the setInterval function and then pass in a callback function, and this callback will be executed every second. And so 1000 milliseconds here. All right. Then each time that this function is called, print the remaining time to the user interface. And then this one here as well. So when we're at 0 seconds, stop the timer and log the user out. So we want to print the time here to this label, which is called label timer. So let me just show it to you here in our elements that I pre-selected. So label timer is the element with the selector of simply timer. Okay. So let's go. So label timer dot text content is equal to the time. And so that's this here. So I forgot to write the name of the variable actually. And now to make this actually work, we also need to remove 1 second in each of these function calls, right? So decrease 1 second. And so time equal time minus 1, which is essentially the same as saying time minus minus. All right. So this is the logic of this timer. We start with a certain number of seconds. Right now that's 100. And then each time that this callback function here is called, we remove 1 second from that. Okay. And so this is called every second. And so basically we will end up with a timer which shows the current number of seconds each second. Okay. And now all we need to do is to then call this function here on login. So, well, let's do that here before updating the UI. So start, logout timer. And now let's quickly log in here. And indeed, you see this number here decreasing now. Okay, so hopefully that that logic makes sense of decreasing 1 second every second. Now, where is that? We have too many functions here, I guess. Oh, here we go. So again, the logic here is to decrease the timer by 1 second every second. And so therefore, we get this number here going down by exactly 1 each second. All right. Now, we don't really want to see only the seconds. We want to see the minutes as well. So basically, we need to convert this simple number of seconds to minutes and seconds. All right. So let's do that here as well. So let's say the minutes is the current time divided by 60. So that's the easiest way, basically, of writing it. So it's not going to be correct, but it's going to show us what we need to do next. Now here we're also seeing already what happens with this timer after a certain number of seconds. So indeed, as soon as the time hits 0, it will not simply stop, right? We're not telling the timer anywhere to stop. And so it will simply continue and become negative. And so that's what we will have to implement then down here. But let's leave that for later. For now, we just want to display the number here in minutes and seconds. But for now, I will just show you the minutes, just to show you what we need to do next. So you see that we have 1 minute, 0.6 or 0.5 something. So it's decreasing every second, but this number here after the comma or after this period doesn't really make sense, right? So basically what we want to do is to take whatever remains of dividing the time by 60, because that will be our seconds. So let me show that to you as well. So seconds will be the remainder of dividing time by 60. And so that's where, again, the reminder function is very helpful. So the reminder operator, actually. So let's now print both of them here as a template literal. So minutes and then colon the second. Okay, and this is still far from being complete, but let's take it step by step here. So you see that this number here is now decreasing very nicely. And it started at 1 minute and 40 seconds. And that's exactly what 40 seconds is, right? So let's do this again, actually. And notice down there how it starts exactly at 1:40. So you saw that? And that 40 appeared because that is the reminder of dividing 100 by 60. So let's see it here in the console. So when we divide 100 by 60, then this is the result. But if we do 100, the remainder, then we get 40. All right? And that's because 1 times 60 plus 40 is then again 100. All right? Now here we actually do not want then this value after the comma, right? We are only interested in basically the integer. And so let's cut off that decimal part by saying math.trunc, all of this here. And then we also want to pad this number here with a 0. So for example, right now we are at 8 seconds or -8, but we want to see 0.8, just like in a normal clock. Okay, and for that we can again use the pad function. So let's convert this here to a string so that we can then call pad start, which should have the length of 2, and pad it with 0, or just the number is okay. And then the same here. And so now we should get a nice looking clock already. Let's actually start at 120 seconds, which is exactly 2 minutes. So you see now it's a nicely looking and nicely working clock, basically. So a countdown timer that starts counting from 120 seconds, which is exactly 2 minutes. And so that's why in the beginning, the seconds is 0, because the reminder of doing 120 by 60 is 0, because 2 times 60 is exactly 120, right? So 2 times 60 is 120, and therefore there is no reminder. So there are no seconds in our case, okay? But let's not do it with only 10 seconds, because then we get that negative, and we can then work with that. So what we want to do here is as soon as we reach 0 seconds, we want to stop the timer and log out the user. So if the time is 0, then we need to stop the timer. And we do that by using clear interval. So remember in the last video, we used clear timeout to stop the set timeout function. And now we can use clear interval to do the same with the set interval timer. All right. Now, in order to make this work, remember, we need to give a name to this timer. So let's simply call it timer. And then here we can use that variable to indeed stop that timer. And then we want to log out the user, which basically means setting the opacity of this whole container here back to 0. So here in our login, we did the opposite. So we set the opacity to 100, and now logging out the user basically means setting it back to 0. And here this text content should also be set to something else, so not the name of the current user. So let's copy that. And so here the welcome label should say login to get started, which is basically also the default that we see right now, right? And then the opacity back to 0. And remember that usually when we first see the application, all of this is actually invisible. And let's do that here, actually. So get rid of this fake always logged in. So we did that before to test our code, but now it's no longer necessary. And so this is how the application is supposed to look like in the beginning. So we logged in, and now our timer down here is running. And so let's just see what happens once it reaches 0. And indeed, we got logged out here. Okay, so that works beautifully. But let me log in again here so I can show you something that happens and that we need to fix. So as I log in, it takes quite some time until something happens here. Maybe you didn't catch that, so let me try it again after we get logged out here. So I will scroll down immediately and then I hit enter. So you see, before it was still at 1 second. So it was the value that we had before. And that happened because this entire function here is only first executed after 1 second, right? So this callback function that we passed into set interval is not called immediately. It will only get called the first time after 1 second. But in fact, we want to call this function also immediately, all right? And so the trick to doing that is to export this into a separate function, then call it immediately, and then also start calling it every second using the set interval function. So let me just show it to you. So I cut the function here. Let's put it here. So we need to give it a name. I'm calling it tick because that's a pretty common name. And now I put it here. And so right now everything is exactly the same as before. But what I wanted to do is to also call this immediately. And so this is how we do it. And so now right away this function gets called, and then after that every 1 second. And so let's try it now again. Let me scroll down here. And you see, this time we didn't have that problem. Now it's simply not counting down, but that's because I did this small mistake here, which you see is very common in development. You will do this also all the time. And well, now we didn't see at the beginning of the timer, but believe me, now it's actually working correctly. However, you might have noticed that we still have a problem, which is the fact that actually we get logged out once this hits 1 second. And so watch closely now what happens when we reach 1. You saw that? And so that's not what we want to happen. This should only happen at 0 seconds, not at 1 second. And the problem here is that we decrease this time by 1 second before checking for 0. So basically the problem here is that in the iteration here, so in the call where the time is 1, right? So here it's going to be 1, and then we decrease to 0, and then we check for 0. And so in this iteration where the time is initially 1, this part of the code still gets executed. And again, because we increase that 1 second to 0 here before this. And so we need to put it after, of course. And so now this part of the code here only gets triggered if the time really is 0 here in this whole function. So now you will see that the logout will only really happen after exactly 10 seconds. So you saw it reached 0, 0, and then we got logged out. Great. So let's increase this here a little bit. And then I will log in as this user. So you see that it's running. And now I will also log in as Jessica Davis, just to see you yet another problem that we have. So you see, it's weirdly alternating between these two numbers. And the reason for that is that right now we have basically 2 timers running at the same time. So 1 timer of Jonas and 1 timer of Jessica. And so that's not at all what we need, right? That's a big problem right now. So how can we fix this problem? Well, basically what we can do is that whenever we log a user in, we check if there is already a timer running, and if so, then we stop that timer. So I believe that is the best solution to this problem. And so what I'm going to do now is to return the timer from this function so that we can then use it here in this callback function of the login and delete it in case that it exists. So let me write that code actually, and then it's going to become a lot easier to understand. So here we will return the timer. And that's important because to clear the timer, so to use the clear interval function, we need the timer variable. And so therefore I'm returning it here. So let's then save it here. So that's down here. And so this is going to be the timer. Now we actually need this as a global variable. So let me put that outside here. So the current account and the timer. And the reason for that is that we need this variable to persist between different logins. So otherwise, after this handler function here would be ready, then the timer variable would disappear. So that's the reason why we have current account out here. And it's also the reason why we need to keep the timer out here. That's the only way in which we can then actually check if it appears. So timer and current account both need to be in the parent scope of this function scope. So let me show you what I mean. So here I will then set the timer to the timer that is returned here. However, if there already is a timer, I first need to clear it. And so let's do that. So if there is already a timer, then clear interval timer. And that's it. So let's think what happens when I log in first as Jonas. So when I log in now, there's going to be no timer, right? So in this situation, there was no timer already, was it? There wasn't, because I just logged out for the first time, and so no timer variable was created. But now, since I did log in, now timer is equal to that timer that I just exported from this function using the return keyword. And so this timer now does exist. And so when I now log in as someone else, so Jessica Davis, for example, then when the code reaches this line here, then a timer will indeed exist. And so then that timer is going to be cleared. Okay? And so now there is no problem anymore. Okay, so now it's running smoothly without any problem. And that, of course, also works when the timer here has a higher value. Let's put it back to 2 minutes. So I can now log in. The timer starts running normally. And when I log in then as Jessica, then the timer gets cleared and resetted basically, and it started again from 2 minutes. Okay? So all this might seem a little bit complicated, I know, but it's all kind of a matter of thinking about what we want our code to do. So all we're doing here is to use all the tools that we already know to basically achieve one goal that we want to achieve, which is, in this case, this timer here running and being resetted each time that another user logs in. Now, another functionality that we want our timers to have is to basically reset once we do something in the account. Because remember, the goal of this timer here is to track the inactivity of the user. So the time where the user doesn't do anything. But if I do something, let's say transfer money, then we should not get logged out. It should be resetted. But as you saw, we still got logged out even after doing that transfer, of course. So what we need to do now is to also reset the timer whenever the user does a transfer or requests a loan. So these are the only two activities that exist in our application. And so these operations should always trigger the timer to be reset. Okay? So let's go here to the transfer. And let's do it here at the end. Reset the timer. So what does resetting the timer actually mean? Well, all we need to do is to basically clear interval using the timer that we already have, and then start it again. So clear interval, and then the timer variable. And so now one more time, it is important that this timer variable is actually a global variable. So a variable that's outside of any of these handler functions. So we define timer, remember, out here, because we didn't want it to be inside of this handler function here. And that was because we wanted this variable to persist throughout multiple logins. But now it's also important because we need it later for other operations. So inside other callback functions. And in particular in this one now. So clear interval of that timer that was defined previously, and then we simply start a new one. So basically we then overwrite that initial timer that we had before. So start, logout timer, and that's actually it. So imagine that the timer was at 1 minute 30 seconds. So when we do a transfer, that timer is cleared and a new timer is started again at 2 minutes. Okay, and now finally the same for requesting a loan. So let's try that. And now the timer is running down here. All right, and now let's try to transfer something to JD, so the other user, let's say 100, And watch what happens down here to the timer now. And indeed, it got resetted to 2 minutes. And the same when we request a loan, let's say 100. And then after the 3 seconds have passed, then our loan got approved indeed, and our timer reset to 2 minutes. Beautiful. Great. So our application is now actually finished and feature complete. Everything is working just as in our demonstration, and I think this was a great application to teach you really a lot of different stuff in JavaScript. So huge congratulations for finishing this great application. It's good to see that you made it to this point with me, and I hope that you're really proud of this application that you just built. You can now show it to all your friends and everyone that you're telling about your coding journey, and I'm sure they will be just as happy as you are about this amazing progress. So once more, great job and well done. And with that being said, I hope to see you soon in the next section where we're gonna build together some features of a real website. So UI components that you find commonly in normal websites, such as sliders or pop-up windows. So that's gonna be really exciting. So I hope to see you there soon.